about African development and what does it mean to talk about development which is locally defined, or development that is actually based on the satisfaction of local people's needs and aspirations. So I'm going to start with this coming to know, and I know you have to leave because you have another lecture at 12:30. So we'll factor that into the timing. And I know Carnegie also wants to talk to some of you, interview some of you too as well. So we'll leave room for quite a bit of that. As I always do, when I give these presentations, I think we need to recognize where we are. The land is always very, very critical, especially when we're talking about the question of indigeneity. And as a chief in Ghana too, right? For me, the elders and our ancestors are very, very important in guiding us spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually in the things that we do. What I'm speaking to you about is basically a capsule of a lecture that I gave in Toronto during one of the major American education research conference when I was invited to give the presidential symposium. So I'm just making some points on that. And it's on the theme, the whole topic was the theme of beyond a single story. We know how sometimes when we present stories, we present them as if that's the only story for everybody. So we talk about Africa and everybody knows Africa. Africa is a single story, right? Without looking at the complexity of Africa, the multiplicity of Africa, the fact that when we talk about Africa, Africa is multiple stories. It's not just a single story, there are multiple stories, and how we articulate that. So that was the theme of the session. And I don't think we can talk about the possibilities of multiple stories without also getting into intellectual politics. And part of the intellectual politics is to talk about the whole notion of how do we come to know differently? That's counter-hegemonic knowing. How do we come to know differently? And this is from the understanding that the ways of knowing, the ways of being, the ways of acting are different, depending on the context, depending on the place, and depending on the politics that people want to pursue. And I think we use this to resist the dominance of particular bodies of knowledge. For example, in my case, I'll talk about the dominance of Eurocentric knowledge, and today we talk about multiple knowledges and the power of that, which is to challenge the single story or the single truth in that. But I think we also do this also to contest knowledge. One of the things, I mean, we are all in the academy. One of the things we're told is that in the academy, it's very, very important to always question, right? So we begin to question that. When we are told about what constitutes knowledge, we begin to ask questions. Why is this so? So that we don't take what is given to us as the truth, the only truth, but as one of many truths, and begin to question that. And I think when we do that, we do the questioning from where we are coming from. Look, I'm speaking to you because of who I am, because of my gender, because of my age, because of my location, and also my status. It doesn't mean I have all the answers. By the same token, somebody who is different and sitting here speaking to you, will speak from their social position, could be a female, or even could be somebody who is bisexual, or could be somebody who is from a different ethnic group. It doesn't mean A is right, B is wrong, but we allow these knowledges to contest, and that's the way of coming to know, to contest knowledge and come to know differently, right? So to me, and remember in one of the lectures that I had with you, I mentioned the question of what are our responsibilities as African scholars? Right, that as African scholars, we have a particular responsibility to challenge the meta-narrative, to challenge the dominant narrative that circulates, that insulting idea that people think, and Kwesi Pratt makes this point, that people think they know us more than we know ourselves, right? So it's very, very important for us to talk about the possibilities and also the responsibilities of the African scholar to come to knowledge and to know differently, to begin to question. Remember last time when we talked, I spoke to you about the power, right, of pioneering new analytical systems for understanding our own communities that are steeped in our own homegrown cultural perspectives. And the current education minister, Kojo Yanka, speaks about this, that we need, as African scholars, we have that responsibility to, nobody is going to do it for us. We have to do it. So our responsibility is not just to take the text and begin to read the text and work with it, but also to take the text and work with it critically, to challenge what has been presented to us as knowledge, whether it's knowledge about Africa or whether it's knowledge about our experiences. Remember also I mentioned earlier in one of the sessions that, for example, growing up in Ghana, I knew more about the waterfalls in North America and Europe. I never knew about the rivers in my own village where my mother caught the fish that I ate. And there's a problem with that. We need to know about our context. And Professor Kola talks about this as contextual learning, that we need to be grounded in our context to be able to deal with the issues and the problems that affect us. And I think when we do this, there are certain epistemic challenges that are presented to us that we need to address in that. So where am I coming from? And I think I'm coming from this, having reflected on my role as an African scholar. And I want you to do that, to reflect on your role as an African scholar or as an African learner or as an African student, to reflect on your role and roles of that, right? And as somebody who is from a Fanon school, Fanon is an anti-colonial theorist, he asks us not to be a conveyor belt for Eurocentrism. In other words, we just don't take Eurocentric ideas and work with them. We need to question them, right? We need to question them. And we also have to talk about what Nondominant talks about, that we don't become intellectual imposters in our institutions. Being an intellectual imposter in institutions, you are not who you are. You mimic theories that hardly speak to your experiences because you want to be validated, you want to be accepted. So even when the theory doesn't reflect on what you know or your experiences, because you want to be seen as a scholar, you mimic it and you run by it when you hardly even understand it, right? And so we shouldn't become intellectual imposters. That's, to me, the whole problem of being an intellectual imposter. You are not who you are. You are not your authentic self because you want to be accepted, you want to be validated, you want to be legitimized, right? And so Fanon talks about a quote, and it's a very famous quote that most people like to draw on. And he says, "Oh, my body, make me always a human who questions," right? That you begin to question everything, right? And I think, to me, as an African scholar, if you're going to question things, then you have to be an interrupter. You have to interrupt the everyday conversations that take place in our classrooms. You have to interrupt the everyday conversations that take place in our communities, because sometimes those conversations can be very oppressive. They can be very dehumanizing to our own people, sometimes even to ethnic minorities or to women or to children. And we need to interrupt this, right? And we are not only becoming interrupters, we also become very, very subversive. Subversive means you want to turn it upside down, right? You disturb the peace, literally, you disturb the peace, because the peace sometimes only enables the status quo to function, when actually the status quo only works in favor of those who are privileged, those who are powerful, and those who have the money, right? So you need to be an interrupter, you need to be subversive, and you also need to articulate your distinctive African voice. As an African scholar, you need to articulate your distinctive African voice. To me, articulating a distinctive African voice is that you ask questions grounded from where and who you are, where you're located and who you are. Is this in the best interest of African peoples, right? The conversations that we are having, is this in the best interest of African people? That, to me, is being grounded in an African voice, the voice of authenticity, right? The voice of the authentic self in that regard. And I think the reason why this is so important is that we know that a lot has happened, but not a lot has changed, right? Sometimes when you see things going on, it's like you see things happening, but nothing is changing. It's only we go in circles. It's all the same old, same old, same old. We go in circles in that regard, right? And I think this is also important for the African scholar, because when we look at our experiences in academia, right, we always have to deal with what I call the travelogue of negation. The negation is where our experiences don't count. Our voices don't count. Sometimes even our knowledges are not counted as valid. So we have to deal with this travelogue of negation. We also have to deal with the politics of refusals. And I think last time we talked about what does it mean to refuse? What does it mean to refuse the university? And let's talk about it. What does it mean to refuse the university? That is to say, to challenge everything that goes on in these institutions. Because remember, again, something that I mentioned that, and a friend of mine, Mulifia Santi, also likes talking about this, that I would like to see an African university. We have universities in Africa, but we are yet to see African universities. They are two separate things. To see an African university is not the same as saying, I've seen a university in Africa. Because the universities we have in Africa at the moment are colonial satellites of the Western Academy. We are mimicking everything that takes place in these institutions. When you see it here, that to me is not an African university. African university has to be homegrown. It has to be based on our knowledge systems. It has to be based on the way we do things, right? And not mimic the way the Western Academy does things. And that's why the current debates about Africanization and indigenization are very, very important. What does it mean to Africanize? What does it mean to indigenize? These are critical questions. And I think last time we talked about this, that as you do your own research, right, ask yourself, what does it mean in terms of the questions I'm asking? How do the questions help me to Africanize the topic I'm investigating? How does it help me to indigenize the issues that I'm working with? It doesn't mean discard those other ideas, but I think it's very, very important to ask these questions about Africanization and indigenization in this context, to ask these questions about that. So what are some of the questions we should begin to ask as African scholars when we begin to talk about coming to know differently, right? I think it's very, very important that as I talk about the importance of talking about African and indigenous knowledge, that we don't get into this idea of relativizing knowledge, which is to say that everything goes, right? I think the whole essence of talking about multiple knowledges is that you are allowing the knowledge to context and challenge each other in order to come to a better understanding of our world. So it's not like everything goes. So, well, this is African knowledge, and then you are not questioning it. You take it for granted. Sometimes you romanticize it, right? You have to question it. That sometimes even when we talk about tradition, whose traditions are we talking about? How are traditions sometimes very oppressive against minorities, against women, against other religious minorities in our communities? Also, how do we come to understand the violence of our institutions, the violence of the academy? When we talk of the violence of the academy, I'm talking here about the fact that sometimes the African thought, the African knowledge systems is negated. Now, the negation of African knowledge is violence. When we negate knowledge about our experiences, when we negate knowledge about our histories, when we negate knowledge about our cultures, that is violence. It speaks to the violence of academia. And also the fact that when we talk of scholarship, the fact that sometimes, remember that example I gave last time where someone said, every peoples have contributed something to Western civilization, except Africans, right? That's violence, right? When you hear that, that's violence. And this is something that sometimes the way we are seen as not having any knowledge, we are seen as not having contributed anything to the globalization of the world or our knowledge. And that is violence, because it dehumanizes us, it makes us small, it makes us as anti-intellectual, and all that constitutes violence. And that's why you and I have that responsibility to put that voice on the table, that wait a minute, we need to hear these voices too, because we have something to say. Whatever it is that we are talking about, we have something to say about it, whether from our history, from our cultures, from our knowledge system. It doesn't mean that we romanticize it. It doesn't mean it's a gospel truth, but it ought to be part of the conversation. It ought to be part of the conversation. In other words, if there is a menu that we are eating, that African menu has to be on the table as well for us to engage in that conversation. And so it leads to us to ask the question to us African scholars, what does it mean to find one center through this entry point of multiple ways of knowing? It means finding one center. Finding one center is you center yourself, you center your history, you center your culture, and begin to ask questions from that. Centering means that's the entry point, and you begin to ask the question. It doesn't mean you stop there. It doesn't mean all what you're going to learn is about your culture, about your history, or about Africa. But you start from there and begin to project onward to the global space or the global intellectual public sphere in that. And that means finding one center in that context. Also, as an African scholar, what does it mean to resist something that I've talked about, this intellectual northerness, as if we have nothing to contribute? That we are nothing. It's that intellectual northerness. What does it mean? And to begin to articulate that, given the fact that we come from a place, we come from a land, we come from an environment, we come from a history, we come from a culture, there are knowledges that come with that, and therefore we have something to contribute. So we challenge this northerness, right? And then how do we respond to the urgency of the African scholar? And this is something that our Education Minister, Julian Katz, wrote a long time ago, to, quote, pioneer new analytical systems, unquote, for understanding our own communities that are, quote, steeped in our own homegrown cultural perspectives. And I think this is very, very important in that regard, to be able to do that. What are also the possibilities of reimagining new geographies of knowledge? The whole question of reimagining new geographies of knowledge is, look, find Africa, find your own community as a new geography of knowledge. Your own community has knowledge, it's a knowledge base. So it becomes a new geography of knowledge. So what does it mean to reimagine these possibilities of new geographies of knowledge? Knowledges that are located, situated, and in many cases emanate from particular environments, particular contexts, because they do inform the way we come to know, they do the way we come to understand, and the way we come to practice, the whole issue of education. And then how do we create the space for other knowledges to coexist? And this is always a challenge. How do we create a space for other knowledges to coexist when there's a dominant knowledge that insists on having all the space unto itself? And to give you an example of what I mean, you see when we look at, say, the power of Eurocentric knowledge. Eurocentric knowledge masquerades as universal. So we are all forced to think along those lines. So it wants to create a space, but it has all the space unto itself. Any body of knowledge that comes is measured, is evaluated, is assessed on the basis of the standards that have already been put in place. And I think we need to challenge that. Remember what we talked about last time? What does it mean, for example, say, when you write, rather than say, Cola 2010, to also put in brackets, as told to me by my grandmother, 2010, right? What does it mean to say that, right? And that, to me, is creating the space for other knowledges to coexist, right? Nobody's going to do it. We have to insist on that. And I think we have discussion last time about what does it mean when you have an instructor or a supervisor who is not going to accept that, right? We have to continue. Just because the instructor will not, or the supervisor will not accept that, doesn't mean that we pull up our arms and say we are not going to insist on that. I think we have to, if you want to trouble, if you want to challenge, if you want to destabilize, right, the everyday knowledge systems, then we have to think about the way that we present different ways of knowing. The epistemic challenge is, I think we have to, and I'm coming at this particularly to situate it in terms of what it means for theory building, right? A long time ago, there was this, it's very humorous, right? But it's true. This question of, can non-Europeans think? Of course we can think, right? But it's because our thought systems have been devalued. Our thought systems have been negated. Our thought systems have been erased. So you can leave somebody asking, can non-Europeans think? Of course we think, right? And I think, to me, Dabeshi, who is an Asian scholar, puts it well. And I'm paraphrasing him when he talks about, we are all entitled to a degree of self-centrism. Remember I talked about finding one center. We are all entitled to that, right? However, the question is not whether non-dominant thinking, right? But non-dominant thinking is thinking that allows multiple ways of knowing, the multiplicity that I talked about, right? Can reach a self-consciousness. But the point is that when we engage in this, whether it allows us to grant the knowledge from our own experience, from our own cultures, from our own location. So when we begin to say, do a research, right? When the questions that you ask, where are the questions coming from? Are the questions also coming from your experience? Are they coming from your cultural knowledge systems? Are they coming from your interaction with your communities? That is informing the way you are asking the questions you are asking. And that, to me, is the epistemic challenge that we have, that when we do research, where do our questions come from? How are our questions shaped? Are they shaped simply because we have read the literature, sometimes the literature which is from somewhere, and we are using it to phrase our questions? Or we are framing our questions on the basis of our own histories, our own experiences, our own cultures, and using that to interact and to dialogue with other bodies of knowledge that exist in the books or in the literature. And I think this, to me, is very, very important in that. I think when we do this, it calls for the need to challenge what I call the grammar of coloniality of science and the universalization of Western thought. And the universalization of Western thought is about the way the particularity of the West or Western Europe masquerades as universal for everybody else, right? To challenge that. But it also has to mean that sometimes we have to challenge our own intellectual discomfort and to question who gets to use their voice, who gets to use their language, who gets to use their history, their culture. Here, what I mean is to challenge our own intellectual discomfort. And I think we talked about this last time too, right? You know, people hear us talk about, Professor Kola and I and others, we talk about indigenous knowledge, right? Sometimes the harshest critic of indigenous knowledge are not other non-Africans, the African peoples themselves. So somebody will be sitting here and saying, oh, well, I'm a scientist, right? I'm a scientist, I've been trained in science. So this thing about myths, mythologies, magic, those are not knowledge, right? And you ask them, why are they not knowledge? They say, oh, no, we are talking of science. And their definition of science is Western science, right? We have to talk about African science. And to me, African science also includes spirituality. It includes myths and mythologies. They're all part of African science. Just because people don't understand them doesn't mean they are not knowledge, right? And we have to be able to deal with this, right? And so we have to challenge our own intellectual discomfort. Why is it that when I speak about indigenous knowledge, because the way we have been schooled, right? You have been schooled in such a way to say, oh, no, well, what Nana is talking about, this is indigenous knowledge, to me, I'm very uncomfortable with it, right? You have to challenge that. Where is that coming from? That's the way we've been schooled. So we negate our own knowledge systems and fill our stomachs, our ears, and our brains with knowledges that sometimes hardly speak to us, right? So we have to challenge our own intellectual discomfort and ask questions about where is it coming from when we do this, right? And remember what I'm saying, it's not to say, look, I don't want to deal with this knowledge. I think it's to use other knowledge to question. So I don't want you to tell me that, for example, I don't want to read Shakespeare. Of course, read Shakespeare. But I also want you to read Wole Soyinka, Amata Edu. But they are equal playwrights that have also contributed to knowledge. And you can identify with them because of who they are. So don't tell me I don't want to read Shakespeare. Of course, read Shakespeare. But I also want you to read Amata Edu, Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, and other African playwrights or cultural theories. And so that you can engage in conversations about Shakespeare from that positionality of having other bodies of knowledge to engage it, right? I think it's very, very important. I think to me, one of the things that I've been working with in my search for coming to know and knowing differently, I call it a search for robust epistemological framework. There are 4 things that guide me in this, right? One is a recognition that the way we come to theorize, the way we come to know, must consider who we are. Who is saying what? Right? Who is saying what? Where is that speaking? Where is that body located? Right? What is the politics that somebody is trying to get across? And what are the consequences and the desires that we want to get across? Also, when we talk about this coming to know and knowing differently, we are talking basically about decolonization. That's what we're talking about. We are talking about decolonization to challenge the coloniality of knowledge. And this decolonization cannot happen solely through Western science. Why is that so? Because Western science is part of the problem. Western science has negated our knowledge systems, our experiences, our culture, and histories. And so you cannot decolonize using that. That itself has been the problem. That means you have to look for other bodies of knowledge and use it along with Western science knowledge in order to engage in this project of decolonization and that. I think also to work with this notion, which I've been talking about, this multicentricity, right? In 1996, when I used the word multicentricity, I was talking about it more in terms of the multiple ways of knowing. There are multiple ways of knowing. We come to know the world differently. There are multiple ways of knowing. We come to know the world differently, right? Given who we are, the histories that we have gone through. And the last point in terms of the way we come to theorize is I also want to engage in something that others have talked about, which is the efficacy and authorization of spiritually centered knowledge, right? Spiritually centered knowledge is working with the interface of the body, mind, soul, and spirit, right? That makes us whole. We have the body, the mind, the soul, and the spirit. We are not just the body and the mind. There's also the soul and the spirit. And so how do we engage that? And I think to me, engaging in the body, mind, soul, and spirit is this idea that I've talked about, which is to say, for example, there's power in not knowing. There's power in not knowing. In fact, that certainty of knowing is itself a problem. That somehow there's a certainty of knowledge. There's also the uncertainty of knowledge. That a child in the classroom should be able to say, I don't know, and not be punished for it, right? So because, you see, we are supposed to know everything. We are supposed to say, I don't know, is like a heresy. You're going to be punished when you say you don't know, right? And so we have to work. And this, again, is about this coming to think differently. That there's a power in saying, I don't know, the uncertainty of knowledge. Knowledge cannot explain away everything about our world, right? That spirituality is a form of knowledge. That just because people believe in the power of spirituality doesn't mean they are cuckoo. That they have something in their head, they are not intellectuals, right? And I think it's very important to us to recognize that if you're going to talk about coming to know differently and working with indigenous knowledge, then we have to get engaged this power of spiritual ontologies or spiritual epistemologies and work with that in that sense. And the others who talk about in terms of the sacred learning space. For example, what does it mean to see this classroom here as a sacred learning space? It means we work with the sanctity of life. It means we begin to respect each other who is here and those who are not even here. That we may not see them physically, but they are present in soul and spirit. They may be dead, but they are here. That they guide us in what we do. And that itself is a spiritually centered space, because when you work with that idea, you're always careful that you don't cause injury and harm to somebody else, because you know somebody is watching what you do. And that's a different way of thinking. So when the violence of the academy as we see it, the way, sometimes somebody says, well, this is mine, right? To me, that's part of the violence of the academy, the mine, not talking about sharing. Look, I'm sharing this knowledge with you not because everything is in me, I know it all. It's because you have something to contribute to the dialogue. It's because Professor Kola has taught me something, just as I've taught him. It's because she has taught me something. That idea is very, very important. And to break away from this cycle of the hierarchy, that there's a smart one and there's a dumb one, right? There's the A+ one and there's a C or the F student. And see ourselves as a circle, that if somebody leaves this space, they take their knowledge with them. And that we are whole as learners when we are a collective, when we are in a community. And that means bring some sacredness to how we come to understand the space that we find ourselves in that regard, right? I just want to reiterate the question of Black African indigeneity, which are some key points about it. And I think some of these things will come, some of the discussions we've had before too on this. Sure, colonialism is not our only story, right? Africa is not only about colonialism. Colonialism is not our only story. By the same token, Europe is not the advent of human history. The world did not begin with Europe. There was a world before Europe. But let's make it that our story is all about colonialism or our story is all dictated. Nothing ever existed until it is discovered by the European. Let's challenge that. And I think I'll give you the story about, people, you hear Mungo Park, David Livingstone, right, discovered what? At Waterfall. And you ask, who is David Livingstone? They will tell you, David Livingstone is a British or a European, and he discovered it. Where is the waterfall? The waterfall is in Africa, right? So before he came, the Africans there didn't know that the waterfall existed. So it is only him who discovered it. Let's challenge that. It's this mindset, right, that I'm talking about. But also, part of that, to talk about the Black African indigeneity, is to confront what I call the hostility and the colonial operation of indigenous, right? Africans and African peoples, we have indigenous bodies of knowledge. Just because of colonialism doesn't mean we have lost our indigeneity, right? And the African Black indigeneity is a very powerful source of knowledge for us, and we have to be able to talk about it. But if you are talking about this colonial appellation of indigenous, you also have to work with the idea that there are cartographies. Cartographies means different spaces of indigeneity, right? That even when we talk of indigenous, it's in the plural. There's not only one indigenous. It's in the plural, right? So in the Ghanaian context, there's the Ghanaian indigeneity, there's going to be the Kenyan indigeneity, there's going to be the Nigerian indigeneity, there's going to be the South African. It's in the plural. Even in Ghana itself, there's going to be an Akan indigeneity, there's going to be an Ewe indigeneity, there's going to be, Ga indigeneity or Adamu indigeneity. There's cartographies of indigeneity in that context.